I grew up in a really rough area in Nottingham in the UK, the kind of place where there was a lot of drugs, a lot of gangs, and a lot of violence. People assume it was a dangerous place to grow up, and that is definitely true in some respects, but the drug addicts wandered out to more well-off areas to steal, and the gangs tended to keep their violence among themselves. The trouble was, if they were at war, you lived on their battlefield, and that meant suffering through all of the horrors that could bring. One incident that really sticks with me happened on Christmas Day when I was 8. My mom had saved up to buy me a pair of rollerblades, and I remember how happy I was when I unwrapped them and saw a brand new pair staring back at me. I couldn't wait to try them out, so I asked my mom if we could go out into the street outside so I could try them out. Like I've mentioned, I lived in a really rough area, but most of the serious violence normally happened on the other side of my estate, which was presumably where most of the gang activity was. But not this time. This was on Christmas morning, so my mom, still half asleep and in her nightie, it was me who rushed to the front door first. It was me who opened it, and it was me who saw the body first. At first, I just thought it was someone sleeping on the tiny patch of grass we call a front garden. Heroin was a big thing in our community, so it wasn't unusual to see someone who'd nodded out in an odd place. Also, keeping in mind that it was still dark outside and the sun only comes up at about 7 o'clock a.m. in the winter here, and this must have been no later than 6 o'clock a.m. I couldn't see what their face looked like, and I certainly would have been able to recognize any dark stains on their clothing. I told my mom that someone was sleeping in our garden, and immediately she rushed out to check. But then, after walking over to the man and giving him a shake, she suddenly barked at me to go back inside the house. The next thing I know, I can see blue flashing lights outside. But thankfully I hadn't quite worked out what was going on, so I got to enjoy my Christmas morning in relative peace and happiness. The man on the front lawn, though he wasn't so lucky. The poor man we'd found had been stabbed 3 times in the back. But because it happened very early on Christmas morning, there hadn't been anyone around to witness it. We just so happened to live right near a school, though, and I'm pretty sure the police used their security camera footage to determine that he'd even attacked about a half-mile up the road. And somehow, even while leaking like a bloody colander, the man had managed to walk all the way up our street and into our front garden before collapsing outside my house. I remember what a huge fuss there was that morning. Police everywhere. Forensics men in white overalls setting up a little white tent out to our front yard. It lasted for almost a week afterwards, too. We weren't allowed to leave the house for a week in case we disturbed evidence. If we did go out, we had to sign in and out with a liaison officer at the end of the street. As an 8-year-old, I couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. It took a while for my mom to finally tell me that someone had died in our front garden. It took even longer for her to admit that it was murder and not just some horrible accident. Eventually, the police found the murder weapon in our neighbor's garden, and the killer was identified from the fingerprints they lifted from it. I didn't hear all of this until years later, but word on the grapevine was that he was a local gang leader and the victim had been one of his best friends. Friends who'd been having an affair with the guy's girlfriend behind his back. I heard they'd been arguing as they were on their way home from the corner shop, and when the friend finally admitted it, the gang leader just stabbed him up, then ran off. The victim was in so much shock that he'd kept walking until he finally fell over. I never did find out their names, either the killer or the victim, but that Christmas will always stick with me. Okay, so this isn't my story exactly, but it's my mom's. But it does involve me in a roundabout way, and Mom's not getting a Reddit account anytime soon, so allow me to tell it instead. My mom grew up an animal lover, and so her dream career was to be a vet. Sadly, she didn't get the grades to study veterinary science, but she did have the grades to study dentistry. And since that would result in a similarly well-paying career, she decided to go with that instead. She gets her degree, moves down to London, sets up a practice, meets my dad. Then a few years later, boom, yours truly is born. My mom started off working mostly NHS stuff, with a few higher-paying private jobs in between. The NHS work was all your regular teeth pulling and whatnot, but the private stuff was generally cosmetic, so it made them loads more money. And then teeth whitening became a thing. You could get your teeth bleached long before the trend set in. But what really sparked it off is that someone invented a much faster, much cheaper way of doing it. After that, everyone and their dog wanted to get their teeth whitened, and it made my mom a fat stack of cash. It also brought in a much more interesting group of patients, which tended to consist mostly of vain or eccentric people with way too much money. So one day, my mom says this fella came into her surgery to get his teeth whitened, and right away she knew that he was going to be trouble. He's rude to the dental nurses. He's covered in drip, and he's generally acting like an arrogant prick as my mom's talking him through the whitening procedure. Then once the job was done and dusted and it came to settling up, the bloke starts giving it the old "don't you know who I am" speech to try and get out of paying. Needless to say, my little old mom was not up to date on the names and faces of local gangsters, which is what he turned out to be, and when he realized that she was son of going to, Budgie tells her to F off and storms out of the surgery. Now, she doesn't get the police involved right away, but what she did do was phone the bloke up and leave a message on his answering machine telling him he had a week to pay what he owed, or she'd be getting the old bill involved. And that's when the threat started. The bloke calls her back at the surgery and starts telling her that if a police car so much as drives past his house, he'd have a business firebombed. Mom still had no clue who she was actually dealing with, so she just reminds the bloke that he had a few more days to pay up or she'd be getting the police involved the very next day. My mom was working on a potty up in her office when she heard a bang, followed by a blood-curdling scream coming from down in the reception area. She excuses herself from the patient and legs it downstairs to find one of her dental nurses is in floods of tears with all the patients in the waiting area looking like they just seen a ghost. Turns out some bloke in a mask had walked into the surgery with a hammer. He had even said a word. He just looked the nurse in the eye before smashing the hammer down on her desk. Then he just walked out of the surgery again. Mom was obviously forced to get the police involved at that point, but she'd also realized what serious trouble she was in with this gangster on her case. If he was a psycho enough to threaten her staff with a freaking hammer, then he might well be psycho enough to burn her business to the ground. This is the same business she'd built from the ground up. After coming from a humble working class background, it was her pride and joy, and the idea of losing it must have been like a waking nightmare for her. The situation then gets even worse. One night when my dad is home alone looking after me, who's still a baby. At that point, Dad says that he just put me to bed when the phone started to ring. It was the gangster who managed to get her home phone number somehow, and my dad threatens me, which my parents found particularly frightening. Because how did he even know I existed? The gangster also claimed to know where we lived, which was obviously pretty horrifying, and it only added to how stressed my mom was, she said. The next few days were some of the longest of her life, just waiting for someone to show up and throw a Molotov into the waiting room or something, but thankfully that never came to pass. Then one day in walks this lovable older Cockney gentleman who has been booked in for a routine checkup. Mama is up to her nose in stress. And it must have been written all over her face, because just before she starts the examination, the patient starts asking her what the matter was. I am guessing it was the granddad energy this bloke was giving off, but Mom said she basically just poured her heart out to the bloke about the trouble she was going through. The sweet old geezer listens intently, then during a law in my mom's rant, he asks her the name of the bloke she was being threatened by. My mom then tells him the guy's name, and after a bit more back and forth, they get on with the checkup. The old geezer is good as gold when it comes to pain. He is an absolute gentleman to all the nurses, and on his way out he says something that my mom thought was really nice and thoughtful. He told her something like, I'll keep you in my prayers. Between you and me, I think your gangster might change his mind and do the right thing. Sweet and thoughtful, my mom thought, but highly unlikely. Then get this, a few days later, the police call her back regarding the gangster not paying her. She'd already reported it by that time, having brought it up when she talked to the police about the hammer incident, but the return call came with some unexpected news. The gangster had told the police that he paid the bill. It could not have been him in the mask with the hammer, because there was an payment dispute. He just needed a few days to get the money together. Mom then gets her receptionist to check the company account, but there are no payments under the gangster's name. But then the receptionist mentions a package that arrived that morning, a small brown envelope with a handwritten address on it. Just on a hunch, Mom, who is not at the surgery at this time, asked the receptionist to open up to see what's inside. And what do you know, there S.A. crispy, 50-pound notes in there, and a note which just said, sorry. My mom is then forced to call the police back with an apology for wasting their time, because she has just found the money she was owed. Obviously that was the drama over, so she was quite chuffed to see the back of it, and she always just assumed the gangster's bark was bigger than his bite, and that he just backed down when the law got involved. But that wasn't the case. Years later, my parents were out for a very fancy anniversary dinner at a very fancy London restaurant they went to every year. On that day, they finished their meal, paid up, then walked outside in time to see this pair of brand new Range Rovers pulled up nearby. 2 sets of massive bodyguard-looking characters climb out of the car's front seats. Then once they confirmed the coast was clear, they opened up the rear passenger doors, and who steps out in some crisp Savile Row looking suit, looking like £1,000,000. The sweet old geyser who'd been so nice when he visited my mom as a patient spots my mom as he gets closer, and he gives her a wave before coming over to say hello. The evenly minted old gazer introduces my parents to his wife, and they have a bit of a chit-chat before parting ways. But just before they do, the bloke says to Momo, "By the way, I heard your trouble with that." Rude young man resolved itself. "Told you he changed." His mind, my dad says, he gave her a cheeky little wink, then joined his wife in entering the same restaurant the penny didn't dropped. From my mom until Dad asked her, "Do you have any idea who that is?" She said no, just that it was an old patient first, then with his stunned look on his face, my dad tells her that her polite old patient was none other than Bobby Cummins. But those of you that don't know, Bobby Cummins was one of the most feared gangsters in the 1970s. His signature weapon was a soft shotgun. Bobby used a very special kind of ammunition for it. They'd take a few shotgun shells, empty out the pellets, or whatever they have inside them. Then they'd fill them up with rock salt. Bobby would then shoot a person in a non-fatal area, meaning dozens of the jagged salt crystals would end up buried in their flesh. Honestly, I can't even imagine how painful that would be. He later decided to turn his life around, and by the time he ended up in my mom's dentist chair, he was well on his way to being awarded some fancy title by the Queen for helping reform the prison system or something. I bet he never fancied himself meeting the Queen back when he was robbing banks and breaking legs. T-point ease. My mom realized that the bloke who'd threatened to burn down his practice hadn't had a change of heart and decided to pay. He'd been threatened into paying by one of Britain's most notorious ex-gangsters, who evidently still had enough clout to get the bloke to back off. A total disaster, completely averted, all because of one chance meeting with some innocuous-looking old guy. The whole thing has become almost like an interesting bit of family trivia now, a close call from the distant past. Everyone always takes joy in how wild the odds are that Bobby Cummins, of all people, would just march in and fix things. But that's the thing that really scares me. I mean, what are the chances of that in a city as big as London? If it wasn't for the very unlikely meeting between Bobby and my mom, my life might be different at best, and possibly non-existent at worst. Suzanne Jane Capper was born on September 1st of 1976 in the northern English city of Manchester. A younger Suzanne was described as a gentle and easily influenced girl, but due to the instability brought on her by her parents' divorce, her behavior began to deteriorate as she entered her teenage years. By age 14, Suzanne was regularly skipping school in favor of hanging out with her former babysitter, Jean Paul. Jean was a major player in a small gang of local criminals and sold amphetamines from her small terraced home in an area known as M. Suzanne's older sister. Michelle was well aware of Jean-Paul's illegal activities and warned her sister that she was falling in with the bad crowd. But Suzanne ignored her and was apparently so swayed by Jean's outlaw lifestyle that she continued to associate with her. One might assume that Jean and her friends treated Suzanne well, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Suzanne was essentially a verbal punching bag for the small group of criminals, and became the butt of many a cruel joke. When asked why Suzanne would want to surround herself with such company, her sister explained that it wasn't that she was scared of them, it's just that she would do anything for them. She pampered their every whim. Over the course of the following 2 years, the group's treatment of Suzanne gradually worsened. She was treated with an increasing amount of contempt, and the group found ways to blame her for all manner of unconnected misfortunes. When a pink duffel coat went missing from Jean-Paul's home, Suzanne was blamed. When one member of the gang contracted lice from somewhere, Suzanne was blamed. And when a man showed up at Jean's house under the impression that it was a brothel, the blame fell once again at Suzanne's feet. By December of 1992, the gang decided that Suzanne had to be punished. So one Monday evening, they invited her over to Jean's house under the pretense of there being a house party. When Suzanne arrived, she was ambushed by 2 gang members named Glenn Powell and Anthony Dudson. Although they remained close, Glenn was Jean's soon-to-be ex-husband, while Anthony Dudson was the boyfriend of another member of the gang, Bernadette McNay. At the behest of their respective partners, Glenn and Anthony held Suzanne down and shaved her head and eyebrows off. Suzanne wept and wailed as Glenn used a pair of dull clippers to basically rip the hair from her scalp, leaving blood trickling down her bare scalp by the time they were finished. Have you ever had a brilliant idea but thought, could I really make that happen? Well, let me tell you about 2 people who did. First, there's Sarah, a teacher who saw her students struggling with math. Instead of just sticking to the old ways, she created a mobile game that turned complex problems into fun challenges. Her school board was skeptical at first, but she didn't give up. Then there's Ben, a city cyclist, tired of dodging potholes. He developed a simple app where users could report road damage in real time, instantly notifying city maintenance. He faced countless technical glitches, but pushed through every single one. Sarah's game is now helping thousands of students love math, and Ben's app has made his city's streets safer for everyone. Their stories prove that one great idea, fueled by passion, can create real change. So, what's your idea? Don't just dream it. Do it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Suzanne was then forced to clean up the mess they had made before the next phase of her punishment commenced. When Suzanne returned from disposing of a freshly cut hair, Glenn Powell blindfolded her before the group took turns beating her. They delighted in Suzanne's inability to defend herself, cackling with laughter as the blows rained down. Before long, Suzanne was curled up in a ball, trying in vain to protect her battered skull. The gang then took the opportunity to beat her with a broomstick before whipping her with a belt, making sure to inflict as much pain as possible with the belt's metal buckle. When the gang was tired of beating her, Gene Powell locked Suzanne in an upstairs cupboard and left her there overnight with no food or water. The following day, the gang moved Suzanne from the upstairs cupboard to a bed in one of the home's back rooms. There she was tied down and tortured for the next 5 days. It started with beatings and verbal abuse, but when Bernadette McNeely took over, the methods of torture became nightmarishly creative. Bernadette began burning Suzanne with lit cigarettes, pulling her teeth out with pliers, and injecting her with liquid amphetamine whenever she passed out from the pain. Anthony Dudson later told police that Bernie McNeely told Suzanne to open her mouth. Then she started hitting Suzanne with the pliers. Then she got the pliers and started pulling one of her teeth out, but it just snapped and chipped. Then she hit Suzanne a few more times, put the pliers on again, and really pulled. She pulled Suzanne's head forward until there was a snap, and then we could see that she had the tooth in the pliers. And she did it again and laughed the whole time. Bernadette also subjected Suzanne to intense sleep deprivation and would place headphones over her ears before blasting her with a song called "Hi, I'm Chucky. Want to play?" by 150 volts. The song contained samples from the movie Child's Play, and it was common knowledge that the movie had terrified Suzanne, so forcing her to listen to the song doubled up as a powerful psychological torture. 5 days into her ordeal, Suzanne was lying in a mess of her own urine and feces, so the gang decided to untie and clean her before resuming her punishments. Suzanne was forced into scalding hot bath water that contained a concentrated mix of boiling water, bleach, and disinfectant. The cocktail of chemicals burned her skin, patches of which were then scrubbed off with a harsh wire brush. Once Suzanne was dressed and tied to the bed again, the gang left a relative outsider to watch over the house, 18-year-old David Hill. David Hill later claimed that he had no idea that Suzanne was being held captive, and once he heard strange groaning noises coming from the home's back room, he was horrified to find her tied to the bed. She asked me if I could help, but I told her I couldn't. David later told police. I asked her who she was. She said her name was Suzanne. She asked me if I could untie her. I said I couldn't do anything. If I did, the gang would have battered me. I didn't know what to do. I was too shocked to do anything. When the gang discovered Suzanne's mother was about to officially report her missing, they decided they had to get rid of her. So a week after she was taken prisoner, the gang forced Suzanne into the trunk of a stolen white Fiat Panda, then drove out to a narrow lane on the outskirts of a place called After being removed from the trunk, Suzanne was thrown into a patch of bramble bushes, and as the sharp thorns tore up her bruised and tender flesh, Bernadette McNeely giggled as she poured petrol over her. Then, once Suzanne had been set alight and her screams of agony filled the night air, the gang howled with laughter and sang a line from the song Disco Inferno. "Burn, baby burn," they sang. "Burn, baby, burn." Once the gang believed Suzanne was dead, they drove back to Jean Powell's home, stopping only to purchase alcohol in order to celebrate the horrifying misdeed. Yet the gang had made one hideous miscalculation. Suzanne wasn't dead. Somehow the starving, bareheaded, half-burned girl managed to stagger over to a nearby road, and at approximately 6:10 a.m. on the morning of December 5th, she was discovered by a commuter named Barry Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe was initially so terrified by Suzanne's sudden appearance that he almost drove his car off the road. But once he realized that he wasn't looking at a monster, but rather a 16-year-old burn victim, he rushed Suzanne to the nearest house in order to get her help. Both her hands were like ash, said the homeowner, Michael Coop. Her legs were just like raw meat. Her feet appeared to be badly charred. I was struck by how polite the victim was. She was constantly thanking my wife for assistance. Margaret Coupe, Michael's wife, who tended to the dying Suzanne, told police. I instinctively went to put my arms around her, but she pulled away because she could not bear to be touched. Her head was shaved and there were cuts to her head. Her face was almost featureless. Her hands were red, raw, and black at the fingertips. Her legs were red from top to bottom. She couldn't bear anything near her legs. Suzanne was so dehydrated by that point that when the Coops offered her water, she drank 6 whole glasses one after the other. The injuries to her hands were so severe that she didn't have the strength to hold the glass and had to have it raised to her lips by horrified Mrs. Coop. After being rushed to the hospital, Suzanne remained conscious long enough to name all 6 of her attackers. But sadly, she was so badly burned that she eventually slipped into a coma. The extent of Suzanne's injuries was such that when her parents arrived at the hospital during visitation hours, they were unable to recognize their own daughter. She was only properly identified by a partial fingerprint from her thumb, the only part of her hands not severely burned. When it was confirmed that the little burned girl was indeed their daughter, Suzanne's mother fainted from grief. She remained by her daughter's bed until December 18, 1992, when Suzanne finally passed away. Detective Inspector Peter Wall of Great Manchester Police was tasked with arresting those named by Suzanne prior to her passing. He later said that Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely laughed and joked with each other during their arrests, a detail he found chilling once it became clear they were guilty. At first, all 6 suspects denied any involvement in Suzanne's murder, and some even expressed remorse at the news of her death. Slowly but surely, certain members of the gang began to crack under pressure, and eventually Anthony Dudson's father convinced him to tell the truth. Detective Inspector Wall later said that as the story began to unfold, we just couldn't believe it. I kept asking myself how one human being could do this to another. Some officers were said to have wept as the extent of Suzanne's suffering was revealed. As news of the grisly crime spread across the rest of Great Britain, dozens of bouquets were delivered to the hospital she died in on December 23, 1992. All 6 of the gang appeared in court to be officially charged with kidnapping and attempted murder, with a trial set for early January 1993. Pathologist. Dr. William Lawler testified that Suzanne had suffered between 75 and 80% burns, and that her chances of survival would have been minimal, even if she had been in such a weakened state. Dr. Lawler also testified that the exact cause of death had been catastrophic heat damage to Suzanne's internal organs, essentially meaning that she had been cooked alive. It is clear that this young girl must have suffered a great deal of pain and had no chance of survival, Dr. Lawler said. But she did fortunately survive long enough to give information which led to the people mentioned being charged with her death. Dr. Lawler then directly addressed Suzanne's mother and stepfather, who were present in the courtroom, saying, "I offer you, not just on my behalf, but on behalf of the whole nation, my very deepest sympathy and condolences at this tragic happening to your young daughter." These were words that were repeated on every TV and radio news program in the nation. As the trial came to a conclusion, the public demanded the harshest possible sentences should the gang be found guilty. On December 16, 1993, the jury retired to consider their judgment. After 9 hours of intense discussion, they announced that a verdict had been reached. Before judgment was declared, the presiding judge addressed each of the defendants, telling them, "Each of you has been convicted on clear evidence of murder," which was as appalling a murder as it is possible to imagine. 24-year-old Bernadette McNee was pronounced guilty of murder, conspiracy, and false imprisonment, and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. 26-year-old Jean Powell and her 29-year-old husband, Glenn, received identical sentences, reflecting their crucial role in Suzanne's murder in light of his cooperation with investigating officers. 16. J. Harl. Anthony Dudson received a lesser sentence, but given that he was intimately involved in trapping and torturing young Suzanne, he was still condemned to 18 years in prison when the sentences were read out in court. 2 of the jurors wept with relief, and there was an outpouring of jubilation from Suzanne's loved ones who were present in the public gallery. Detective Inspector Wall was then asked by journalists if he believed Suzanne's killers were criminally insane psychological. Reports say that these are absolutely sane individuals. He told them it's frightening that there are such ordinary people there. There's nothing special about any of them. Maybe that's what makes this case so particularly terrifying. The people who imprisoned, tortured, and wrote Suzanne Capper alive were completely sane, and despite dabbling in petty crime and drug trafficking, were not known to be physically violent. Something drove them to commit one of the most shocking criminal acts of 20th century Britain. Perhaps it was some kind of cruel group dynamic, a brutal pecking order with Suzanne positioned at the very bottom. She was ridiculed, cawed, and otherwise dehumanized, until the killers were able to laugh and sing as they burned her alive. The gang weren't insane, and despite committing an evil act, they weren't completely evil people. Yet something allowed them to torture a 16-year-old girl. For the better part of a week before murdering her in one of the worst ways imaginable. Perhaps there is a some kind of primordial savagery in all of us. Something our parents and teachers work very hard to rid us of, and in some cases a little piece of that savagery still remains. I used to be quite a chubby teenager, and I used to get bullied something rotten for it at school. My older brother, on the other hand, was very athletic and used to train down at this boxing gym not far from where we grew up in Warrington. Around the time of my 14th birthday, I was sick to my back teeth of all the abuse that I was getting, most of which was centered around my weight, and after complaining to my brother about it, he suggested I join in him a few training sessions down at the boxing gym. I could lose weight and learn to defend myself all at the same time, and although it was tough going at first, it was one of the best decisions I'd ever made. I slimmed down the bully and stopped, and I grew to love boxing so much that I kept training there long after. I lost the weight. The gym me and my brother trained at was owned by this massive former bare-knuckle boxer named Sean. Sean liked to project the image of a lovable Rogue One who'd turned over a new leaf after a wayward youth. He'd bit of debt collecting for some big-time gangsters. He had been to prison for a few years. He had a variety of gruesome-looking scars all over him, from what he claimed were various attempts to take his life. After getting out of prison, he'd seen the error of his ways and had decided to stay on the straight and narrow by opening a boxing gym. He was definitely still involved in criminality in some way, as all kinds of dodgy-looking people walked to and from his office without ever putting on a pair of gloves. But he was a good trainer, and he kept the membership fees cheap, so none of us really seemed to mind. In fact, some of the lads my age thought Sean's gangster past was quite glamorous, and if I'm honest, I did a bit too. Getting out to fight by someone who had been there and got the t-shirt made it feel like I was really getting my money's worth. Sean was so encouraging and supportive that I thought he was the bee's knees. My older brother didn't seem to be much of a fan, though, and said he only used to train at Sean's gym because it was cheap. He couldn't wait until he had the money to train somewhere else, and he was quick to warn me that Sean wasn't all he cracked up to be. My brother later told me that he kept me in the dark regarding most of Sean's more disturbing misdeeds. Going to the boxing gym meant that I was physically fit, able to handle myself, and the social side of things really helped me come out of my shell. The last thing he wanted to do was ruin that for me by telling me a load of horror stories he didn't even know were really true or not. And because of that, it wasn't until I turned 17 that he actually told me the worst of what he'd heard. At that point, I'd heard so much other stuff about Sean that my brother's stories actually sounded believable. Word on the street was that back in the day, Sean used to be a total psycho. People said he was so aggressive and casually violent that even the toughest underworld figures were scared of him. Given his reputation, Sean excelled at debt collection. My brother told me a lot of the people Sean collected money from were just being extorted in some way. After they'd been given a good kicking, most of them paid up. But then this one bloke just didn't want to pay Sean his money, and it got to be a huge problem for him. No matter what Sean and his crew did, the bloke just refused to give in, pay out. They battered him, kidnapped him, tortured him, but he still refused to give them any money, because the debtor was involved in a crime himself. It's not like he'd just go to the police for help. After months of increasingly creative methods of intimidation, Sean and his crew arrived at a bit of an impasse. Any increase in the intensity of the violence, and they risked killing the bloke. So they had to come up with something horrifically unconventional to get them to pay up. Sean was apparently psycho enough to do things that other debt collectors wouldn't dream of doing. One night, Sean and his crew rolled up to the bloke's house, but they weren't carrying weapons or torture devices like they had the last few times they visited him. That time, all they had with them was a video camera and a jar of Vaseline. I honestly can't bring myself to go into detail about what Sean and his crew apparently did to the bloke. But let's just say they overpowered him, humiliated him, and got the whole thing on camera to use as blackmail material. A few days later, the guy they thought would never break stopped by a pub Sean was drinking in and handed him every penny he owed. It was thousands upon thousands of pounds too. all in cash, all in a neatly sealed brown envelope. That was that Sean had his money. When word got around that Sean had managed to make this bloke crack, his reputation grew even more fierce. But getting all that money and reputation came at a cost. The debtor Sean and his crew had so horrifically humiliated ended up taking his own life a few months later. As much as I've heard some skin-crawling rumors about the incident, I don't know exactly what was done to the bloke. But whatever it was obviously just too much for him. Knowing that there was a videotape of the abuse he just went through, I can imagine why the idea hanging over your head would drive you mad. The fact that the bloke then topped himself was something I found incredibly disturbing. It made me think the rumors are true, and that Sean and his crew subjected the bloke to a fate worse than death. Plus, like I mentioned before, I'd heard enough messed up stuff about Sean for the Vaseline story to be scarily believable. After hearing all of that, I understood why my brother wasn't so keen on Sean and why he didn't hang around the gym outside of training and sparring. A few weeks later, when I didn't feel like training at Sean's gym anymore, I mentioned it to my brother. I somehow got it into my head that he'd be disappointed in me, that he'd see it as me quitting. But he was just relieved. The only reason he carried on training at Sean's was just to keep an eye on me. So hearing that I wanted to train somewhere else was music to his ears. We ended up having to get the bus to this more expensive gym that was further away from us. By that time, my brother could pay his own membership fees, so my parents weren't all that fussed about giving up a few extra quid a month. I was always worried I'd bump into Sean and he'd ask me why I didn't go to his gym anymore. I wasn't scared he'd hurt me or anything, but I knew I'd find it very hard to hide what I wasn't saying, if that makes sense. I thought he was the dog's bollocks. I proper looked up to him, but after hearing the Vaseline story, I realized he was actually the last person on earth I should be idolizing. The scariest thing about Sean was that he could act like a nice normal person, but he clearly wasn't. He was a violent psychopath, and if I just so happened to owe him money, I know he'd have no problem doing something horrifying to me. Born in September of 1931, Arthur Thompson was just 7 years old when the flames of war engulfed the world for the second time in 25 years. A terrified young Arthur lived through the German air raids which struck Glasgow during March of 1941. The terror he endured during the bombings are thought to have a profound effect on him. On the nights of March 13th and 14th of 1941, thousands of Glasgow's residents were killed or wounded by German bombs. In one area of the city, only 8 of 12,000 civilian homes remained undamaged. On the morning of March 15th, the result was nothing short of devastating. Apocalyptic for the people of Glasgow, and it was with the backdrop of utter destruction that a young Arthur grew into his teenage years. Post-war, Britain was a hellish place to grow up. Food was still rationed, hundreds of thousands of buildings still lay in ruins, and devastating poverty was depressingly common. As a result, petty crime skyrocketed and loan sharking became a highly profitable endeavor for those with the capital and the muscle. Arthur Thompson was already a small-time crook by his mid-teens, but when Hyrid Mora decided to venture into the loan-sharking racket, his wealth and power skyrocketed. This was mainly due to Arthur's ability to terrorize those who could undonor their debts, and if a debtor reneged on their deal, Arthur was subject to an impromptu crucifixion after having his goons restrain a person with their palms pushed flat. Against a wooden floor, Arthur would hammer nails into their hands until they were completely pinned to the floor, while generally remaining a non-fatal form of punishment. The more fear spread by such terror tactics meant Arthur gained reputation as one of Glasgow's most feared gangsters, yet power did not come without enemies, and as Arthur's infamy steadily increased, so did the assassination attempts. In 1966, he narrowly escaped a fiery demise when a bomb exploded under his car. Arthur somehow survived the blast with nothing but minor injuries. His mother-in-law, on the other hand, was killed instantly. Arthur was so enraged that in spite of his wounds, he got into his car. Maureen went out looking for the perpetrators. It was long before Arthur spotted 2 men from a rival gang, both of whom he suspected of having a hand in the bombing. The guilt of Patrick Welsh and James Goldie was confirmed when both members of the Black Hill gang fled. Arthur's attempt to conversate, and he was forced to pursue them in what amounted to a terrifying car chase. Both vehicles were a hair's breadth away from a catastrophic crash of numerous occasions, but at some point, Arthur was able to force the men Van Reedmore off the road and into a lamppost. The impact was devastating, and both members of the Black Hill gang died in agony on there. Way to the hospital, Arthur was subsequently charged with 2 counts of murder, yet it came as no surprise to the police when they were forced to drop the case against him. The streets been packed on the day of the car chase, but not a single glass sweep volunteered to testify in court. Such was the power that Arthur wielded in his community. It should also be noted that 3 years after the Black Hill Gang S-bomb raid, Moriatak, Arthur's wife Rita, forced her way into the home of Patrick Welsh's widow and stabbed her in the chest. The victim only narrowly survived her horrific injuries, and Rita Thompson spent the next 3 years in prison for her crimes. But Rita's jail sentence did nothing to quell the coming blood feud. And even today, the descendants of both families live in anonymity to avoid a rekindling of the conflict. As Arthur grew older, even more attempts on his life forced him to reconsider his position as a hardened more criminal mastermind. He stepped away from illicit ventures and began to invest his earnings into legitimate businesses. And by the early 9 South, Arthur was earning up to £1,000 a week in clean, untouchable currency. Yet as Thompson's son had grown older, he began to follow in his father's criminal footsteps, and by 1991 he was one of Scotland's most prolific drug traffickers yet. Arthur Jr. wasn't nearly as diplomatic as his wise old father had learned to be, in his rise to power ruffled the feathers of many a rival trafficker. On August 18th of 1991, Arthur Jr. walked out of his family's proven mill home only to be greeted by a torrent of gunfire. He was hit 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the head, and he passed away in the driveway of his childhood home before paramedics could save his life. Bizarrely, Arthur Thompson had a problem cooperating with police, with his wife joining him for a number of extensive police interviews. Many of Arthur's past and present associates were aghast at the move, as it came from a man who believed death was a preferable alternative to. Yet it wasn't long before the reason for his cooperation became clear, and it demonstrated how Arthur commanded a terrifying level of power and influence. Just days after Arthur Gia's murder, the arrest of Paul Ferris stunned the Thompson family and their associates, as such a flagrant betrayal was a rare event indeed. But once he was in custody, the reason for AR's cooperation became clear. He knew he might not be able to identify his son's killers alone, but with the vast resources the police had at their disposal, they might find the task much easier. Only when Ferris was officially charged with murder did Arthur strike, and on the day of his son's funeral, Glasgow police discovered a car containing 2 dead bodies parked on the route of Arthur Gia's funeral. The bodies belonged to 2 men named Robert Glover and Joe Hainan, 2 men who just so happened to be close friends with Paul Ferris. Whoever had killed the men had ensured their deaths had been agonizing, and both bodies showed extensive signs of prolonged and brutal torture. Paul Ferris went to trial for Arthur Gia's murder in 1992, but lack of compelling evidence meant he was found not guilty, and was therefore released. As you can imagine, Paul Ferris then vanished without a trace, but whether or not this was at the hands of the Thompson family is another question entirely. By early 1993, Arthur had lost 2 of his 3 children to gang violence and drug addiction, and when he passed away from a heart attack on March 13th, many said he died of a broken heart. The 61-year-old's life had been tough from the very beginning, and from the deprivation of his youth, a vicious, cold-blooded monster emerged, one who wanted to make everyone else just as scared as he was on the nights the bombs fell. I used to hang around with some really bad people. I was much younger at the time, 13 to 14, that kind of thing, so I didn't know any better than to look up to all the big lads on our block. They had flash cars, got loads of girls, and some of them even had a gun. And it was all from selling drugs and doing robberies. Me and my little group of mates used to do quick little jobs for them to earn a few quid, and the big lads always treated us like grown-ups. I didn't realize it back then, but they were basically grooming us to be ads who ended up pulling the trigger or stabbing someone up, and it was by design too. That way the big lads could completely disassociate themselves with any dealing or violence. We do the time, so they didn't have to. I didn't get that far though, because my mom ended up moving us over to Bren, which was well out of the way of my old ends. That was my way out otherwise. I'd have been trapped in that life, and I probably would have ended up like that guy I'm about to tell you about. Like I said, I was all in. At first I was making money. I had bare trees. All the kids in school thought I was a bad man. It was good times, but then I actually saw the reality of gang life, the actual end result of all that bravado and posturing, and it put the fear of God into me. I remember it was a Sunday in the summertime, really hot summer too, and I was coming back from the shops on my bike with a few bits and bobs from my mom. I rode past this one alleyway, and I see one of my boys like leaning against the wall with his back to me. I knew it was him because he always wore the Sadados jacket with the Rasta color stripes, so I stopped my bike and gave him a shout to see if he wanted to lift back to the block. The way he kept leaning against the wall with his back to me, it made it look like he was holding something heavy around. waist height, but then when I saw his face and especially his eyes, I knew something was seriously wrong. He looked terrified, and his lips were all gray. Then when I rushed over to see what was wrong, I saw he had both hands clamped over his stomach because that weekend had been so hot. My mate had just been walking around in his jacket with no t-shirt on, trying to impress the birds with his abs sore. Whatever, but that only gave me a really good view of all the stab wounds around his stomach, and how he was basically holding his own guts in with nothing but his hands. He just kept saying, "I need an ambulance or I am going to die," over and over again, but I didn't even say anything back to him. I just ran back to my bike, bombed it back towards the block, and started shouting at everyone to call an ambulance, because Emmy had been stabbed. I remember to this day how I could actually see some of his insides, like a little bit of S-guts, were actually poking out through one of the holes in his stomach. It was the most horrifying, disgusting thing I'd ever seen. But weirdly, it was not what actually put me off the lifestyle. The aftermath was all anger and revenge. We wanted to hit back at whoever had hit us. You think I'd have tried to get out of there and then. But the feeling of unity honestly got me through the trauma of seeing Emmy all stabbed up like that. What made me realize that I was up for the consequences was seeing Emmy wearing a Colosi bag when he got out of the hospital. I didn't actually know what one was until I heard Emmy got one, and I didn't even know they existed or that getting stabbed could do that kind of damage to someone. I know that sounds quite naive, but I was 14 and stupid. I didn't know nothing about the world, so the idea of Emmy not being able to go to the toilet because his bowels were sliced up, that seemed like it was worse than losing your life. I know that's obviously a stupid thing to think, but I'm glad that it scared me so much. Otherwise I might not have that come to Jesus moment, as they say that so many young gangsters have had before. Will you realize the only future you have is death or prison? Whoever said sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me was a bloody liar, because the pain I felt when I heard my wife of 15 years tell me, "I don't love you anymore," was astronomical. It was a visceral, physical sensation, one I suppose some people might call heartache, and it was so terrible that I didn't eat or sleep until I finally turned to the bottle. To facilitate both, I continued to drink all throughout the divorce, and somewhere along the way strong painkillers entered the mix. Less than a year later, I was living as a functioning alcoholic in a small apartment, but the deeper I slipped into addiction, the less I was able to remain functioning. In the end, I got sacked from my job for being drunk on duty. I was served an eviction notice. I lost almost everything, and if it was not for a last-minute placement in a hostel-based rehab wellness program, I'd have actually been flat-out homeless. The hostel was located in this big red brick Victorian building, maybe a mile or so outside the city center. Although it wasn't entirely free, the wellness program was subsidized by the city council, so it didn't cost too much per night. It was also run on a completely voluntary basis, meaning you could check out whenever you like, and the staff provided a variety of services and amenities to keep you from relapsing, it seemed. The only real downside was that I'd have to share a room with someone. Little did I know it was the companionship that really got me through. I stayed in a large bedroom with 2 single beds and an ensuite bathroom, and when I arrived I was paired with a guy named Andy. Like I said, I'm too happy to be sharing a room with a total stranger in a while. I am sure the hassle was just happy to pack the rooms out with paying guesses. It was a buddy system by design. After hours, when the hassle was kept running by a skeleton, crew roommates could keep each other accountable, and like I also mentioned, that SWAT really got me sober. Andy's situation was almost identical to mine. His wife had an affair, she kept the house, he got addicted to crack and heroin, then lost almost everything he said. The only thing that stopped him from just ending it all was the idea of his daughter. Growing up without a dad, so right when he hit rock bottom, he begged an old friend to help him get a place at the wellness center. It was a familiar story, and we initially bonded over our shared experiences in football chat, but then by the time we were going through the worst of the withdrawals together, I was actually shocked at how much me and Andy had bonded. We could barely get out of bed, either from shakes and chills or just raw depression. And although all the staff had and nurses that visited us were fantastic, it was mutual support and solidarity that really got us through. But even after the worst, the physical symptoms withdrawal had subsided. This black cloud of soul-crushing depression remained over me, and in a moment of madness, I made a serious error of judgment. As I might have mentioned, our presence at the hostel was entirely voluntary, meaning we could just leave and visit some nearby shops if we felt well enough, mentally speaking. I've even